Please bear my child. Chisholm's hand stopped moving. The IV bag she had been adjusting hung between her fingers, forgotten. The monitors kept their steady rhythm. The room held its antiseptic smell. The curtains were drawn against Sol's evening light, and the only sound was the soft mechanical beeping that had become the background noise of her entire existence in this mansion. Everything in the world continued exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago, except for those 6 words still hanging in the air between her and the man lying in the bed. Kang Min-jae was looking at her, not with the cold dismissal she had trained herself to expect, not with the sharp impatience that had made her feel like furniture in her first year here. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he has exhausted every other option and arrived at the only one that matters. His face was hollowed by months of illness. His body was half the size it had been in the photographs lining the study downstairs, but his eyes were identical to the eyes in those photographs, dark and still, and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with dying. "Everything I own," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but each word was placed with precision, as if he had rehearsed this and the rehearsal had cost him something. "My empire, my name, every asset, every property, every account, all of it goes to you and my heir. You will want for nothing. Your children will want for nothing. 3 generations of your bloodline will want for nothing." Chisholm set the IV bag down carefully. Her hands were steady. 2 years in this mansion had made her hands steady in situations that would have undone other people. She smoothed the edge of his blanket. She checked the monitor reading she had already checked. She straightened the tray on his bedside table that did not need straightening. Then she walked to the door. "I'll bring your evening tea in an hour," she said. She closed the door behind her and stood in the corridor with her back pressed flat against the wall and her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Down the hallway, a window let in the last of Seoul's amber evening. She could hear the distant kitchen sounds, muffled footsteps of the remaining staff, the hollow normalcy of a house that had been quietly dying alongside its master for months. One by one, the staff had found reasons to leave. A sick parent. A better offer. Some hadn't bothered with reasons at all. They had simply stopped appearing. Chisholm had watched them go, and stayed, and never examined too carefully why staying felt more like identity than duty. She pressed one hand against her stomach. 8 weeks. She had known for 10 days. The test had been taken in a pharmacy bathroom 3 streets from the mansion on a Thursday afternoon, and she had walked back through Seoul's early spring streets in the kind of silence that follows a door closing on a life you had barely finished building. The father was gone. Quiet. Mutual. Nobody had been cruel. But he was gone. And she was here. And the life growing inside her was the only secret she had ever kept that frightened her in the deep, specific way of something with no clear resolution in sight. She had been deciding, turning the geometry of it in her hands each night before sleep, examining it from every angle and finding no angle that was clean. And now this. She pushed off the wall and went to make the tea. Park Ji-ho was in the kitchen when she arrived. He stood at the counter reviewing his phone, suit jacket folded neatly over a chair the way he always did when he stayed late. He looked up when she entered and gave her the smile she had received 100 times. Warm, unhurried. The smile of a man who understood precisely how much work a well-maintained impression does in a house full of people watching each other. "Chisholm," he said, "you look tired. Sit down, I'll have someone bring the tea." "I'm fine," she said. "I prefer to do it myself." He watched her cross to the kettle with an expression she had spent 2 years attempting to fully read, and never quite managing. Park Ji-ho had been the one to hire her. 2 years ago, he had sat across from her in the small office off the main entrance and asked questions that had nothing to do with cleaning credentials and everything to do with character. How do you respond when someone speaks to you without respect? What do you do when the environment around you becomes unpredictable? She had answered honestly because she hadn't known any better, and apparently honesty had been exactly what he was testing for because he had offered her the position that same afternoon and told her she was exactly what the household needed. He had been kind to her consistently since then. A better brand of tea appearing in her break room without comment. a warmer coat left on her chair when January made the mansion cold, genuine feeling questions about her family in Enugu. She had been grateful. She remained grateful. She simply no longer knew with certainty what the gratitude was resting on top of. He asked you, Park said. Not a question. She kept her eyes on the kettle. I don't know what you mean. Chisholm. His voice carried the patient gentleness of a man correcting someone he genuinely liked. I have worked beside Minjai for 11 years. I know how his mind moves. He has no air and the organization is everything to him. Of course he asked you. She turned and looked at him directly. His face was open, readable, giving her nothing that resembled threat. She had learned to check for that with him specifically. She always found nothing, and the finding of nothing had become, she was only now understanding, its own kind of warning. What would you say, she asked carefully, if he had? Park considered this with the air of a man who took questions seriously. Then he said, whatever you decide, make sure it is what you want, not what anyone else needs. From you. He picked up his jacket and folded it over his arm. Good night, Chisholm. Don't stay too late. She listened to his footsteps leave the kitchen and stood with the kettle beginning to boil behind her, and the feeling she always carried after a conversation with Park Ji-ho, that she had been given something whose purpose she didn't yet understand. She took the tea upstairs. Minjai was awake. She set the cup on the tray beside his bed. She turned to leave and he said her name. Just that. She stopped. I know what I am, he said. I know what I have been in this house to you. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. Then what are you asking? To stay, past all of this. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. I treated you badly. Not from hatred. I treated you badly because I am a man who was not built for what I was feeling, and I did not know what else to do with it. I have watched you for 2 years. Every man in this organization knows not to look at you for too long because they know what would happen if they did. I never told you this. I never found words that didn't sound like something I had no right to say to you. The monitor beeped. The tea steamed. Chisholm stood with her arms at her sides and felt 8 weeks pressing against the inside of her chest, like a door that needed to be opened and could not be opened yet. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, she said. She did not sleep. She lay in her third-floor room and turned the full impossible geometry of it over and over until the shapes became too familiar to keep frightening her. A dying man. An empire with no heir. A child she was already carrying that was not his. If she said yes, she was building everything on a foundation with a crack running through it that would eventually surface. If she said no, she was returning to nothing. No position. No safety. No plan in a city that did not belong to her. 8 weeks along. Completely alone. But underneath the calculation, something else moved. The image of his face when he said, I did not know what else to do with it. The memory of a glass thrown against a wall not at her, but because another man's eyes had stayed a moment too long. A man who had been conducting a 2-year private war with his own tenderness and losing it badly and not knowing how to stop. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach in the dark. I will figure it out, she said to no one. Then she made her decision and stopped arguing with herself about it. The next afternoon, she sat in the chair beside his bed and looked at him clearly and said yes. The relief that crossed his face was so unguarded, it looked almost like pain. She filed it in the same place she filed everything. If you are watching this for the first time, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because this story has barely started pulling the thread, and you do not want to miss a single thing that unravels from here. Park Ji-ho received the news that same afternoon, with a smile that reached all the way into his eyes and hands that remained perfectly still at his sides. He congratulated them both. He took Chisholm's hand and held it warmly and told her he had always known she was someone exceptional. When he released her hand and turned to speak to Minjai about logistics, his gaze moved across the room with an efficiency she had never noticed in him before. Flat, measuring, like a man running a rapid calculation behind a face that had been trained never to show it. It lasted less than a second, and then he was warm and devoted again, and she told herself she had imagined it. She did not entirely believe herself. Within 24 hours of Minjai's announcement, the mansion reorganized itself around Chisholm's new position. She was moved to the inner rooms, better furnished, closer to Minjai's quarters, with a lock on the door and a window facing the interior courtyard. Park arranged it personally and told her it was for comfort and safety. She thanked him. She noted that the inner rooms were also further from every service exit and the street. 3 days after the announcement, on a Tuesday evening with the light going orange, a car appeared at the eastern gate. Dark, unmarked, idling at the far property line. She watched it from her window for 11 minutes. It did not move. Then it was simply gone. She went to Park the following morning and told him. He nodded and said he would look into it and redirected the conversation before she could ask anything further. She filed it, and now the SEO faction began to make itself felt in ways that had no single definitive shape, but accumulated into something she could not ignore. She heard it first from the kitchen staff. A delivery driver who came twice a week and talked too much mentioned that men from the SEO organization had been seen outside the homes of 3 mid-level men in Minjai's network, offering meetings, offering positions, offering futures. An empire whose leader was dying was an empire already being measured for new ownership, and the CEO family had been waiting for this particular vacancy for a long time. Then, a staff member she had known for 18 months didn't arrive one Monday morning. Park told her the man had resigned. She nodded. That same evening, she saw a car she recognized from the eastern gate, idling now on the western side. Different position, same car. She said nothing to Park this time. She filed it, and she watched, and she began to understand that the walls of this mansion were not keeping danger out. They were keeping Minjai in, and the danger had already been inside for longer than anyone had measured. The pattern she had been observing for weeks sharpened into something she could no longer attribute to the unpredictability of illness. On the days Park delivered the afternoon medication personally, a practice he had established early, calling it his duty as the most trusted man, Minjai was worse by evening, slower, more confused, sometimes unable to finish sentences he had begun. On the days Park was out of the mansion, and the medication was administered by the attending nurse, or quietly delayed, Minjai had clear hours. Sometimes startlingly clear. Alert in ways that made her hold her breath and start counting. She had been attributing this to the body's inconsistency. Illness was not linear. She had told herself this with the discipline of a woman who knew the danger of building a conclusion on correlation alone. But the pattern did not stop, and it did not vary, and after the 3rd consecutive week of it, she stopped attributing it to anything except itself. She needed to see the preparation. She found her opportunity on a Thursday afternoon. She positioned herself in the corridor, running alongside the medication preparation area under the pretense of retrieving linens from the supply closet, standing in the gap of the partially open door where the angle gave her the counter and nothing else. Park arrived at 3:15 as he always did. He was meticulous. He measured the prescribed components with practiced efficiency. He had done this dozens of times, and his body knew the sequence without thinking about it. Then his hand went to his inner jacket pocket. He removed a small vial she had never seen on any prescription list. He measured from it with the same precision he applied to everything. Added it to the medication, without hesitation. Not a man doing something new, a man doing something routine. He pocketed the vial, arranged the tray, lifted it, and turned toward the door. He saw her. The corridor went completely still. Park Ji-ho looked at her standing with a linen in her hands, and something crossed his eyes so briefly she would have missed it with anyone else's face. Something cold and calculating that vanished so fast it left no trace. Then he smiled. "Making sure everything is exactly right," he said pleasantly. "The boss deserves only the best." He nodded at the linen. "Found what you needed?" "Yes," she said. He carried the tray past her. She listened to his footsteps until they entered Minjai's room and the door closed, and then she stood in the corridor with the linen in her hands and the sound of her own heartbeat, very loud, in a very quiet space, and understood that she had just seen something she could not unsee, and that Park Ji-ho was now standing in that room deciding how much she had understood. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and did not move for a long time. That night, she rebuilt everything from the beginning. Every observation she had stored across weeks, every file detail, every moment she had attributed to coincidence and told herself to leave alone. The pattern of good and bad days was not a pattern of illness. It was a schedule. Min-jae was not dying of whatever unnamed condition Dr. Shin had been managing. He was being managed toward dying by the man who had selected Dr. Shin, the man who had spent a year restructuring the organization, moving loyal men outward, installing his own in their place. The man who had been building a relationship with the SEO faction, the organization best positioned to absorb a leaderless empire. The man who had placed Chisholm in this house 2 years ago and had been kind to her ever since in the specific directed way of someone making an investment. Park Ji-ho had been positioning her, keeping her close and grateful and watched. And now she was carrying the named heir of a dying man, and that made her either a tool he could use or a liability he needed to remove, and she did not know which calculation he had already made. She got up before dawn and sat at her desk and thought until the thinking produced a shape she could act on. She needed confirmation. She needed a witness. She needed to move before Park decided the 3 seconds he had spent looking at her in that corridor were 3 seconds too many. Dr. Shin was a quiet man who moved through the mansion like someone practicing invisibility. Chisholm found him Friday morning as he packed his bag after the morning visit and asked if she could speak with him about the pregnancy. He agreed with the visible relief of a man grateful for a question he knew how to answer cleanly. She asked her supplement questions, her dietary questions. Let him settle into the comfort of professional ground. Then she said, "May I ask you something else? About Mr. Kang's symptom pattern." His hand stilled on his bag. She described what she had observed, clinically, without conclusion attached. The good days and the bad days. The correlation with the afternoon timing. She laid the pattern on the table between them and stopped talking and waited. Dr. Shin looked at the floor. When he spoke, his voice had no volume to speak of. He said, "The medication schedule as I prescribed it, and the schedule as it has been administered are not the same." She kept her face exactly where it was. He said, "I identified the discrepancy 6 weeks ago. I brought it to Mr. Park. He told me I was misreading my own records, that any modifications were on Mr. Kang's direct instruction. He said this to me in a way that made the consequences of continued questioning very clear. I have a daughter in university. I have a wife. He stopped. She asked, "What is in the second vial, doctor?" He looked at her for the first time with his full attention. The look of a man who has been carrying something in a locked room for 6 weeks and has just been handed the key by the only person who came looking. He told her. She thanked him. She stood. She walked back through the mansion to the inner rooms and sat down on her bed, and for approximately 90 seconds she allowed herself to feel the complete weight of what she now knew. Then she put it somewhere functional and began to build. Park Ji-ho had been poisoning Kang Min-jae, methodically, patiently, with the hands of a man who had decided this outcome was inevitable and had simply taken responsibility for its timeline. 11 years of standing at the right hand of the most dangerous man in the organization. 11 years of learning exactly how an empire was assembled, so that when the architect was removed, he could step directly into the blueprint. And the clock was not on her side. The cumulative damage to Min-jae's system had a point of irreversibility, and she was inside 72 hours of it. She thought about Auntie Bora. She found her in the lower kitchen at the back of the house. The old gas range, the bone broth, the small wooden table. Bora looked at her over her cup and waited with the patience of someone who had outlasted many urgent people and was not surprised to see urgency arrive in this particular form. Chisholm said, "I need to reach 2 men. Men who were part of the inner circle before the restructuring. Men who would still come for Min-jae's name." Bora set her cup down. She said, "How long have you known?" Chisholm said. Long enough. We have 72 hours. Maybe less. Bora looked at the table. Something moved through her face that had been waiting a long time to move. She gave 2 names and a number before Chisholm could ask if she had them. Choi Hyun and Choi Byom, brothers, removed from the organization 8 months ago when Park restructured. Still loyal to the name Kang in the way that certain men's loyalty is not a position they hold, but a thing they are made of. Tell them Auntie Bora sent you, she said. Tell them it is time. The weight of those 4 words filled the small kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and then Chisholm stood up and went to do what needed to be done. Right now, pause and tell me in the comments. At what point did you start suspecting Park Ji-ho, and what was the moment that confirmed it for you? Because what is coming next is going to make you feel every second of what Chisholm has been carrying alone. The next 40 hours were the most precisely controlled of Chisholm's life. On the surface, she was unchanged. She moved through the mansion with her usual rhythm. She tended to Min-jae with her usual care. She spoke to Park with her usual warmth and received his usual kindness and gave him nothing. Not a flicker of altered behavior, not a question that reached beyond its stated purpose, not a single beat of eye contact that lasted a moment too long. She had spent 2 years making herself invisible in a house full of dangerous men. She understood how to occupy a room without disturbing its atmosphere. She had never needed that skill more than she needed it now. But underneath the surface, she was moving everything simultaneously. Through Bora, she reached the Choi brothers. They responded within 6 hours. Choi Hyun was the older one, quieter, with the deliberate stillness of a man who had made serious decisions before and understood their weight. Choi Byom was faster in his thinking and his movement. They communicated through Bora as intermediary. Nothing written, nothing that could be recovered. The plan built itself in pieces across 40 hours until it was complete enough to execute. Meanwhile, she watched Park watch her. He was good at it. If she hadn't been watching him watch her, she would never have noticed. Small things, the way he positioned himself in rooms she entered, the questions he asked about Min-jae's mood and appetite that were just slightly more detailed than his usual questions, the way his eyes moved to the medication tray whenever she was near it. He was not certain what she had seen in that corridor. He was deciding. She could feel him deciding, and she understood that the moment he finished deciding, she would have no margin left. She moved on the 42nd hour. The window was the afternoon medication. She needed 2 unobserved minutes in the preparation area, and she needed Park occupied elsewhere. She carried the replacement in the interior pocket of her uniform, and felt its weight against her ribs all morning. Dr. Shin had prepared it. Clean, properly dosed, the correct quantities. He had done it the previous evening with shaking hands and the expression of a man stepping off a ledge he had been standing on for 6 weeks. At 3:15, Auntie Bora sat down heavily in the main corridor and put her hand to her chest. Not dramatically. A quiet collapse from a woman who moved quietly. It reached 2 staff members in 30 seconds and Park Ji-ho in 90 because Park made it his business to know about every irregularity in the mansion's order. Chisholm was already at the preparation counter. Her hands were the steadiest they had ever been in her life. She made the switch with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed it in her mind so many times that the physical execution felt like retrieval rather than action. She arranged the tray exactly as Park arranged it. She was back in the corridor before Park came around the corner. He saw her. His eyes went to her face, then to the preparation room, then back to her face. She said, "Auntie Bora had a dizzy spell. I came to find you. Mr. Kang has been asking for you since this morning." Park looked at the preparation room one more time. The tray was where he had left it. Everything was where it should be. He looked at her face, and she gave him the open expression of a woman who had no reason to look away, and he nodded and went to collect the tray, and administered the clean medication himself, with steady, confident hands, believing it was his own work. She watched him do it from the doorway. By that evening, Min-jae was sitting up asking for food. By the following morning, his eyes were clear, and his voice carried its full depth, and when she came to him in the early afternoon, and sat in the chair beside his bed, and said, "I need you to hear everything, before you respond to any of it," he looked at her with those clear dark eyes, and said, "Tell me." She told him everything: the pattern, the corridor, the vial, Dr. Shin, Bora, the Choi brothers, the SEO faction, the car at the gate, the medication she had switched. Everything assembled in order, without drama, the way she had built it across weeks of watching and filing and refusing to name it until she was certain. Minjae did not move. The light came through the curtains. The monitor beeped. Down the corridor, a door opened and closed, and ordinary sounds continued in a house whose foundation had just been removed from beneath it. Park Ji-ho, 11 years, a man who had sat in cold rooms with him before there was an empire to speak of, who had stood beside him at his mother's grave with his head bowed and his hands at his sides, who had bled alongside him in the early years when the organization was still something you built with your hands rather than administered from a distance. 11 years of a loyalty so consistent it had stopped being something Minjae verified because he had stopped being able to conceive of its absence. Minjae looked at the ceiling. His jaw was set. His hands on the blanket were still with the specific stillness of a man holding something in because the room was too small for what would happen if he let it go. Then he looked at Chisholm and said, "How long do we have?" She said, "If Park has noticed the change in you, hours. If not, until tomorrow morning at the latest. He will run the numbers tonight, and when they don't add up, he will move." Minjae said, "The Choi brothers are positioned?" She said, "Since yesterday." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had first seen when he said, "I did not know what else to do with what I was feeling." It had traveled further now, past gratitude, past relief, into something that sat in a man's chest when he understands fully what has been done for him, and by whom, and at what cost, and realizes he has no adequate response to any of it. He said, "After this, we are going to have a long conversation." She said, "Survive first." He almost smiled. Then Kang Min-jae came back into his eyes fully, and he said, "Call Choi Hyun. Tell him tonight." Park moved before 10 o'clock. She would never know with certainty what the trigger was. Whether the nurse's early evening report on Min-jae's improved vitals had run against his internal timeline and produced an alarm he couldn't ignore. Whether he had found something microscopically inconsistent on the preparation tray. Whether the 3 seconds he had spent looking at her face in the corridor had been turning over in his mind since Thursday and had finally resolved into a conclusion. It didn't matter. At 10:17, she heard the eastern gate and knew from the quality of the sound that it had not been opened by anyone loyal to Minjae. They came in quietly. Park's people and Seo soldiers, moving through the perimeter with the ease of men who had been given the layout in advance, the layout of every entrance, every corridor, every possible exit, the layout that only a man who had lived inside this organization for 11 years could have provided. Chisholm was dressed and moving before she consciously decided to move. She reached Minjae's door, opened it. He was sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know," he said. She got him to his feet. The weeks had taken from his body in ways the cleared medication could not immediately restore, and she could feel him pushing against his own physical limits with everything his will had left. She put her arm under his. He took it. They moved into the lower corridor where Bora was already positioned with her small bag, and Choi Hyun was at the passage door, the narrow entrance behind the cold storage that opened into the service corridor most of the current staff had never had cause to find. They went through. The passage was low-ceilinged and cold and smelled of stone and old air. Min-jae's breathing was controlled and effortful, and she counted the distance to the extraction point and kept them moving. Above them, the mansion was becoming loud. Shouted instructions, running footsteps on the upper floors, something heavy falling. She counted distance and kept her arm steady and did not let the sounds above determine their pace. 40 meters, 30, 20. The door at the service junction was not clear. 2 men came through it from the opposite direction. Not ACO, not Park's people. A third element she had not calculated. Opportunists with their own intelligence about the mansion's most vulnerable night. They came through fast, and the corridor gave no width and no cover, and no space to position Min-jae away from the contact. Choi Hyun moved first. Min-jae pushed off the wall with a force his body should not have contained and used his frame as physical obstruction. Chisholm moved to the outside of the contact and the blow that had been traveling toward him. Min-jae's ribs found her instead. It caught her low and hard. She heard something she did not want to hear. She felt something she did not want to feel. She understood it in a single specific instant, with a clarity that removed every other thought from her mind except one. And she took that one thought and she locked it in the deepest room inside herself. And she closed the door and she did not open it again. Not now, later. She would open it later. She grabbed Min-jae's arm. "Move," she said. They moved. The pain was immediate and precise, and she put it outside the circle of everything she was allowed to think about right now, and she kept her arm under his, and she kept their pace, and she counted down the distance. 10 meters. 5. Choi Beom had the door in the vehicle running on the service road outside, and they came through into the cold Seoul night, and she got Min-jae into the back seat and got in beside him, and Choi Beom was moving before the door fully closed. Behind them, the passage entrance received Park's men 43 seconds after it became empty. In the vehicle, Min-jae turned to look at her. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, and her eyes forward, and her breathing even with the discipline of a woman who had decided what she was allowed to feel right now and what she was not. She said quietly, to herself, to the dark, to the thing she had locked in the room inside her, "I'm not losing you both today." Min-jae heard it. She felt him hear it. He said her name in a voice she had never once heard from him in 2 years, stripped of everything, carrying nothing but her name, as if it were something he needed to hold. She looked forward. She said, "We're out, we're clear. Choi Beom, drive." Min-jae reached across and took her hand. He held it with both of his. He did not ask any of the questions she could feel gathering in him. He held her hand, and she stared through the windscreen at Seoul's nighttime streets and kept her breathing even. And the city moved past the windows, and she locked the door on the room inside her and told herself, "Later. You can open it later." Park Ji-ho did not go quietly, and he did not go fast, but he went completely. From the secured location, a property maintained under a name that existed nowhere in Park's accumulated intelligence, Min-jae made the calls that needed to be made within the first 12 hours. He was weak, and the weakness made him methodical in a way that was more devastating than rage would have been. He dismantled 11 years of Park's careful construction with the precision of a man who had built it and therefore knew exactly where every supporting piece was hidden. Financial records that Park had buried in subsidiary accounts surfaced through men who specialized in exactly that kind of excavation. Communication logs between Park and the SEO family leadership were extracted and verified and delivered to parties who had been waiting years for leverage of this specific quality. The SAO organization, presented with a choice between exposure and retreat, chose retreat with the speed of men who had families and assets and long memories about what happened to organizations that Kang Min-jae decided to dismantle. The alliance collapsed in 36 hours. Park Ji-ho was removed from his car outside a restaurant in Gangnam on a Tuesday morning by men who had been waiting in the cold since before dawn. He did not resist. He was too intelligent to resist. He sat in the back of the vehicle with his hands in his lap and his face composed, and Choi Hyun, who rode beside him, said afterward that Park had looked out the window the entire drive and had not said a single word. Not one. 11 years of calculation and positioning and patient methodical work, and at the end of it, he had nothing left to say. The organization did not fall. It had been built by a man who understood that the difference between an empire and a ruin was the quality of the people who believed in it when everything was uncertain. The Choi brothers held the center for 72 hours, while Min-jae recovered enough to make the calls that reasserted his name. Men who had been waiting on the edges of the restructured hierarchy came back. The structure steadied. It was not what it had been before the illness, and it was not what Park had been shaping it toward. It was something new, and it held. 3 weeks later, the safe house had become the closest thing to a home Chisholm had inhabited in years. 4 rooms, a courtyard that collected the afternoon light in long, warm panels. A kitchen Auntie Bora had claimed on the first morning with the unhurried authority of a woman repossessing something that was always hers. The bone broth appeared 3 times a week on the old portable range she had insisted on bringing. Min-jae ate it without complaint, which Chisholm understood to be, from him, an expression of profound gratitude. He was recovering with the deliberate stubbornness of a man whose body had been through serious damage and whose mind refused to accept the pace the damage required. He pushed every day. Every day, Chisholm told him to stop pushing. Every day, he pushed slightly less than he wanted to, and slightly more than she recommended, and they had arrived at a negotiated middle ground that neither of them acknowledged out loud. He talked. More than she had heard him talk in the entire 2 years combined, as if the illness and Park's poison had been damming something in him that went beyond the physical, and the clearing of it had released a pressure that had nowhere else to go. He told her about his mother, a school teacher from Busan, who had married the wrong man and raised the wrong kind of son, and had loved him anyway, with a ferocity that still lived in this safe house through Auntie Bora's presence, and the way Bora looked at Min-jae when he wasn't watching, like something she had tended for a long time and was not finished. Tending. He told her about the organization's early years, the cold rooms and the decisions made in them, the things that had been necessary, and the things he had told himself were necessary, and the difference between those 2 categories, which had gotten harder to maintain over time. He told her about the first morning he had seen her cross the main hall 2 years ago. Not the first time he had noticed her, which had been before that, but the morning the thought had arrived in him, fully formed and completely unwelcome. I am in serious trouble. And what he had subsequently done with that thought, which was to maintain a careful, cool distance that had apparently succeeded in making her feel like furniture while doing absolutely nothing to resolve his actual problem. She told him this was the least functional romantic strategy she had encountered in her adult life. He said, I am aware. I was not working from a position of expertise. She said, what position were you working from? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, panic, mostly. She looked at him. He looked back. And something shifted between them that had been trying to shift for 2 years and had finally found enough open ground to move. She told him things too. About Inugu and her mother, and the egusi that had a 3-state reputation, and a recipe that had never been written down. About the nursing degree she had abandoned halfway through, when the fees outran the scholarship, and the specific quality of that failure. Not the shame of it, but the grief. The mourning of a version of herself she had been certain about. About 2 years of doing difficult invisible work in a house that was falling apart and what she had made of it privately. The dignity of being the last one standing, the satisfaction of excellence that nobody was measuring, the particular loneliness of being good at something that makes you disappear. She did not tell him about the 8 weeks. She told herself it wasn't time. He was recovering. The organization was stabilizing. There would be a right moment. She filed this reasoning carefully and did not examine it because she suspected it would not survive examination, and she was not ready for what came after it did. But she watched him. The way the rust left his laugh day by day until it became a real sound. The way he looked at her now, no longer like surveillance, no longer like a man afraid of what he was feeling, but like a man who had run out of reasons to keep the feeling behind glass. The way he reached for her opinion before making decisions about the organization's rebuilding, not performatively, but genuinely, listening to her answers with the full weight of his attention. The way Auntie Bora watched the 2 of them across the kitchen table and said nothing and looked satisfied. One evening, the courtyard light was coming through the open door in long orange panels across the floor, and Min-jae was on the low couch with his legs stretched out and his tea going cold beside him. And Chisholm was moving through the room, adjusting things that did not require adjustment, because she needed something to do with her hands, and the energy that accumulated in her when she was near him had to go somewhere. He watched her. Then he said, "Come and sit down." She sat in the chair across from him. He said, "You said something. The night of the escape. In the vehicle." She held his gaze and said nothing. He said, "I'm not losing you both today." I have been turning that over since that night, and I think I understand what it means, and I need you to tell me if I'm right." She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "It was a long night. People say things they don't fully mean under that kind of pressure." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 11 years reading people who were trying not to be read, and said nothing further. He let it rest. But his eyes told her clearly that he had not let it go, and would not let it go, and was willing to wait for as long as she needed him to wait. She appreciated that, more than she could say. She was not ready to say any of it yet. 1 week later, morning light, clean and early, coming through the window she had adjusted. Minjai sitting up in bed after his medication, his color better than it had been the day before, which had been better than the day before that. Chisholm reaching up to angle the window higher so the light came fully into the room. He reached over and rested his hand against her stomach. No preamble, no announcement. With the quiet, natural ease of a man who had been building toward a gesture for long enough that performing it felt inevitable. His palm was warm and steady against her, and she went completely still. "Little princess," he said softly. "Come soon." Chisholm turned slowly and looked at him. His face was open in the way it had been learning to be open, unguarded, unhidden, carrying everything he felt in plain sight, as if he had finally accepted that this was allowed. He was looking at her like she was the thing he had been trying to say for 2 years, and had only just found the language for. Despite everything, despite the locked room, and the 3 weeks, and the things she had been carrying in careful silence since the passage. She laughed. A real one, surprised out of her from somewhere underneath all of it. She said, "How do you know it is going to be a girl? You want a girl running your empire?" He said, "Why not? If her mother can save me, she certainly can." The laugh stayed on her face. 1 second. 2. And then something happened to it that she could not stop. It didn't announce itself. It came the way grief comes when you have held its shape so precisely for so long that the muscles responsible for maintaining it finally meet something warm enough, and safe enough, and real enough to release against. Her mouth first. A tremor she did not catch in time. Then, her eyes filling before she could close the distance to somewhere private. And then she was crying in a way she had not allowed herself to cry since that corridor, since the low ceiling and the cold and the specific moment when the blow landed and she understood what it had taken from her, and she locked the door on it and kept moving because she had to keep moving, because there was no version of that night where she stopped. Minjai went completely still. He looked at her face. He looked at his hand on her stomach. He looked at her face again, and the understanding moved through him slowly, and then all at once, and she watched it arrive in his eyes, and watched it change everything in his face, and he did not speak for a long time. His hand did not move from her stomach. He asked, very quietly, "When?" She said, "The passage, when I was hit. I knew immediately." He said nothing. She said, "I didn't stop. I wasn't going to lose you and fall apart at the same time. I wasn't going to lose you both and survive it. That's what I meant when I said, her voice went. He reached for her with both arms, and she came without any resistance at all and pressed her face into his shoulder, and for the first time since the night she saved them both, she stopped holding the shape of it. She grieved, without management, without discipline, without filing it somewhere functional, so the rest of the work could continue. She grieved the 8 weeks and what they had been becoming, and the loss, and the 3 weeks of carrying it alone through his recovery, and Bora's broth and the empire stabilizing, and his laugh losing its rust, and all of the ordinary days she had moved through with the locked room inside her, and the key in her hand, and the decision every morning not to open it yet. He held her without speaking. His arms were around her completely. His hand moved in her hair and stayed there. He was a man who had not known what to do with a tenderness for most of his life, and he was learning now in real time what it required, and what it required in this moment was simply this, his full presence, unhidden, unguarded, given to her without reservation. She had carried this alone, so he could live. She had walked a passage in the dark with a grief she refused to put down because putting it down meant stopping, and stopping meant losing him. She had made the choice that night with the clarity of a woman who understood exactly what she was choosing and had chosen it anyway without hesitation, and had not told him because he needed to survive first, and the empire needed to hold, and there was always something that needed to come before the thing she was actually feeling. He held her until the crying had finished running its course, and she was quiet against his shoulder. Then he said, "We will try again. When you are ready, not for the empire and not for the heir. When you want to, for no reason except that you want to." She was quiet for a moment against his shoulder. Then she said, "You said, little princess." He said, "I did." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "I have excellent instincts." She said, "You are being poisoned for 4 months by the man you trusted most and did not notice." He said, "I noticed you. From the first week, I noticed the way you moved through a room like you were trying not to take up more space than you were given. I noticed that you gave yourself exactly half the time any task actually deserved because you were too disciplined to let anyone see you take a moment for yourself. I noticed that you were the best person in that house, and that everyone in it was too busy protecting themselves to see it. I noticed everything about you for 2 years, and did not know how to say any of it. So I said nothing, and I am sorry for every day of that." She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. He looked back. She said, "That is the most you have ever said to me at one time." He said, "I have a backlog." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she rested her head back on his shoulder and closed her eyes, and the orange light of the late afternoon lay itself across the floor of the room, and outside the courtyard held its quiet, and soul moved in its ordinary evening rhythm beyond the walls. She said, "She would have been extraordinary." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head and held it there. He said, "Yes, she would have been. And so will the next one, and I will be here for all of it, every moment of it. That is a promise I will not break." She believed him. That was the thing that surprised her, how completely and immediately she believed him. A man who had thrown a glass at a wall because he didn't know what else to do with love. A man who had been slowly killed by his most trusted person and saved by the one person in his house who had no obligation to save him. A man learning, day by day and at considerable speed, what it meant to let someone matter to him without building a wall around the feeling. She believed him. 6 months later, she stood in the courtyard in the full afternoon light and told him. He went still in the way she had learned meant the feeling was larger than his face had yet organized itself to contain. He looked at her. He kept looking at her. And then something broke open in him and he laughed. The full version, long and real and completely unguarded, belonging entirely to a man who had stopped being afraid of his own happiness and found that happiness, freed from fear, was considerably louder than he had expected. He said, "Boy or girl?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Girl." She said, "You have no empirical basis for that." He said, "I have instinct. My instincts are excellent." She said, "Your instincts did not identify an 11-year conspiracy operating 12 inches from your face." He said, "My instincts identified you. Everything else is details." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at this man, this difficult, complicated, slowly opening man who had once made her feel invisible and now looked at her like she was the only thing in any room worth seeing. And she thought about Inugu and the pharmacy bathroom and the passage at midnight and the locked room and the key, and every morning she had chosen to keep it locked until the time was right. She thought about the belly rub and the laugh that broke. She thought about his arms around her and the backlog of 2 years of unsaid things finally finding their way out. She thought about a girl who would have been extraordinary. She put her hand in his. She said, "I think it's a boy." He said, "It's a girl." She said, "We will see." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest where she could feel his heart doing its steady, reliable work, and he looked at her with everything he had. No glass, no walls, no distance, no misdirected anger standing in for the thing he couldn't say, and he said, "Whatever comes next, you are not carrying any of it alone. Not one day of it. I promise you that." She looked at him. She said, "I'm going to hold you to that." He said, "I know. I'm counting on it." Kang Minjai had built his empire on the conviction that trust was the luxury of people who could afford to be wrong. He had built walls and called them strategy. He had dismissed everything that tried to live behind them as liability he could not carry. He had watched a woman move through his house for 2 years and felt something enormous and done everything in his power to make her feel nothing in return, because it was safer, because safety had always been the primary value, because he had learned very young that the things you let yourself want were the things that could be used against you. It took her staying when everyone left, seeing what no one else was looking for, walking a passage at midnight with his weight against her shoulder and a grief she locked away so she could keep moving, coming back to him every morning after, with her hand steady and her face composed, and the locked room inside her that she carried alone so that he could have time to heal before she let him see what the healing had cost her. It took all of that to teach him that the only wall worth building was the one you built around the people you refused to lose. She had built that wall around him before she had any reason to, before he had given her a single reason to. She had built it out of something that was not yet love when she built it, but had become love somewhere in the passage, somewhere in the vehicle, somewhere in the safe house courtyard, somewhere in the orange light and the bone broth and the backlog of 2 years of unsaid things slowly finding their voices. He was going to spend the rest of his life being worthy of the woman who had refused to lose him first. If you stayed until this last line, then you know this story was never about an empire. It was about the person who stays, like this video if Chisholm deserved better from the very first day. Subscribe because the next story is already waiting, and I promise you it is going to reach into your chest and rearrange something. And leave a comment. Who did you want to survive more, the empire or the love story? Because in this one, somehow, both made it out.